Imagine, for a second, living in a state that pays you to live there. Seriously, not for a job, not for some service you provide, but just for being a resident. Every single year, a check for thousands of dollars just shows up. Sounds like a fantasy, right? Well, for the last 40 years or so in Alaska, it's been a reality. Today, we're diving deep into the story of the Alaska Permanent Fund, this really grand, kind of radical experiment that turned every citizen into a shareholder in the state's oil wealth. And as you'll see, it's an experiment that's now at the very center of a fight for Alaska's soul.
So let's get right to it. Why? Why would a state do this? This payment, you see, isn't a handout, not in the usual sense. It's a dividend. And figuring out why it exists is really the key to unlocking one of the most fascinating and, frankly, one of the most contentious political dramas happening in America today. So this thing is called the PFD, the Permanent Fund Dividend, and it's a direct payment to Alaskans from this massive state-owned investment fund. Think of it like this. Alaska strikes it rich with oil. But instead of just letting the government spend every last dime of the royalties, they made a different choice. They decided to save and invest a big chunk of it. And the earnings from those investments, well, they get shared with the people. It was, on the surface, a pretty simple idea that would end up having some incredibly complex consequences.
And this quote from Governor Jay Hammond, he's really the architect of the whole thing, it tells you everything you need to know. He was deeply worried about something called the Alaska syndrome. That classic boom and bust cycle where a flood of oil money creates this huge bloated government that just collapses the second the oil money dries up. So his solution was pretty radical. Give the people a direct cut. The dividend wasn't just about sharing the wealth. It was a clever way to make every single Alaskan a watchdog, giving them a personal stake in protecting that money from political pet projects. And for decades, the system actually worked pretty well. Oil prices were high, the fund just kept growing, and those dividend checks kept coming. But then, the exact crisis that Governor Hammond was so worried about, it finally arrived.
And this was the size of the hole. When oil prices around the world just cratered back around 2016, Alaska, a state that relies almost completely on oil revenue, was suddenly staring down a budget deficit of over $3 billion. The state was just torching through its savings at a totally terrifying rate.
With revenues dropping by more than 80%, the state was backed into a corner with an impossible choice. All the options were just politically toxic. Do you gut essential services like schools and public safety? Do you create an income tax in a state that's famous for not having one? Or do you touch the third rail? Do you break the promise of the PFD? And that single choice right there set the stage for the bitter political war that has basically consumed Alaska ever since. And that war, it just carved this deep, fundamental divide right through the state. It was about the purpose of government, the meaning of the dividend. Really, it became this massive tug of war for the state's future.
And this is the core of the whole fight. You've got two camps. On one side, you have people saying, look, a functioning government is the most important thing. When there's a crisis, you have to use the money you have, and that includes the PFD earnings to pay for schools and cops and roads. But on the other side, you have folks saying, whoa, hold on. That dividend is the people's property. It's not some government slush fund. They argue that cutting it is basically a tax that hurts the poor the most, and that the real answer is for the government to get smaller. Both are deeply, deeply held beliefs, and they've split the state right in two.
This quote from back in 2017 really nails that fund government perspective. This is House Rules Chair Gabrielle Ledoux, and she's basically saying that arguing over tiny budget cuts is a total waste of time when the House is on fire. For her and her allies, the number one priority was funding government and finding new money, even if that meant they had to ignore the old PFD formula. And here's the counterpoint. This is from Governor Bill Walker, who, by the way, was the one who made that first historic cut to the PFD. He didn't frame it as a choice, but as a failure by the legislature to do its job. He argued that lawmakers were just kicking the can down the road, avoiding the tough decisions, and that forced his hand to protect the fund for the long run. As you can see, the blame game was in full swing. Now, to try and get out of this political gridlock, the state made a change. It's a technical change, but it is profoundly important for how it uses the permanent fund. So stick with me here, because it gets a little into the weeds, but it is absolutely essential to understanding the fight that's going on today. So the permanent fund, it actually has two parts. You've got the principal. Think of that as the main savings account. It's constitutionally protected. You can't touch it. But then there's this, the earnings reserve account, or the ERA. This is the pot of money where all the fund's investment profits go. You can think of it as the fund's checking account. And here's the crucial part. It can be spent with just a simple majority vote in the legislature, and that's why it became the battlefield. So, in 2018, to try and create some kind of stability, the legislature brought in this new system, the percent of market value, or POMV. The idea was to create a predictable, sustainable amount of money they could pull from the fund each year to help pay for government. The formula allowed them to pull 5% of the fund's total value every year. Sounds reasonable, right? The problem, though, is in how they pull that money. Let's just walk through the mechanics real quick. Step 1, they calculate that 5% draw based on the entire fund. That's the protected savings account plus the spendable checking account. But step 2, the law says the cash can only actually be withdrawn from that much smaller spendable checking account, the ERA. And the result? Step 3, the amount they pull out is often way bigger than what the fund earns in a year, which means the state is slowly but surely draining its only accessible savings account to pay for government services. So what's the bottom line here? Well, that old formula for the dividend, the one that had been used for decades, it was effectively thrown out the window. The PFD is no longer a set, defined share of the profits. Now, it's just whatever happens to be left over after the government takes its big cut. The dividend went from being something like a protected right to just a budget left over. Okay, so that's all the political maneuvering and the fiscal mechanics. But what has this decade of fighting actually meant for the people of Alaska? Well, the impact has been enormous. This chart tells the whole story, really. It shows the gap between what the PFD should have been under the old law versus what people actually got paid. You can see in 2016, the gap was about $1,000 per person. Fast forward to 2021, the law said the dividend should have been almost $4,000, but Alaskans only got a little over $1,100. Year after year, that gap between the promise and the reality just got wider and wider. And this is the estimated grands total. Since 2016, over $10 billion, that's billion with a B, that would have gone directly into the pockets of Alaskan families was instead used to fund the government or was just kept in state accounts. It's a staggering transfer of wealth, no matter how you look at it. And the consequences of this have just rippled all across the state. Legally, a 2017 Supreme Court decision basically settled it. The legislature can legally cut the dividend. Economically, studies from the University of Alaska show these cuts have hit families hard and have actually increased poverty rates. Politically, this annual PFD fight has paralyzed the legislature, leading to endless gridlock and special sessions. And the end result of all of this, public trust has been shredded, feeling this deep frustration with a government that just seems locked in a perpetual, unwinnable war with itself. Which brings us right back to where we started this whole thing. After all the political fights, the lawsuits, the budget crises, Alaska is left grappling with the exact same fundamental question it faced when the oil first started flowing all those years ago. The permanent fund dividend, it's so much more than just a check. It is, just like Governor Hammond wanted, a test of democracy. It forces this constant, really difficult conversation about the balance between what we owe ourselves as individuals and what we owe each other as a community. And for Alaskans, the answer to that profound question, who really owns the oil? Well, that remains very much up for debate.